Hello. We've been talking about signs and seasons, and we're going to continue with more on that. And today, I think we'll start with a bit of treatment of some of the religious festivals that go on around the world and show how they are linked to the cycles of the heavenly bodies, especially the sun and the moon. Because we began this series on signs and seasons with the premise that the celestial bodies, that includes the luminaries of the sun and the moon in particular, have been given for signs and seasons, and they regulate the religious life of people on the planet. For those who are working in this space of peace education and interfaith conflict resolution, it is important to have an appreciation of how people practice their religion, especially through key festivals and markers in the year, key observances that power the religion, and that are points of important commemoration for events in their religion. There are opportunities to remember and to celebrate what's important to the religious adherents. In Iran, for example, there are a number of faith traditions. There's the very ancient one of Zoroastrianism. And there have been other ones in the course of history, including dualist religions, because Zoroastrianism was a dualist religion. Even before the great religions of the Middle East, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, they all have a kind of dualism built into them, good versus evil. It was there before any of them in ancient Persia, in the Zoroastrian religion. And Persia has produced other religions, as I say, and in modern times, the Baha'i faith has come from Persia as well. But all the way along, they have observed their new year, which is called Nowruz, meaning new year in Farsi, around the time of the spring equinox in the Northern Hemisphere. This is the equinox that, for those who are minded in a tropical astrological way, begins with the Aries equinox on the 21st of March. It may fall a day either side, but it's more often than not celebrated on the 21st of March. And this has been not only significant for the Iranian people and their religious heritage, but it has become an international event recognised by the United Nations. So they mark Nowruz as well, New Year, Iranian New Year, at the 21st of March. That's an example of a festival that is dependent upon the equinox. And we know that in the annual cycle, there are 2 equinoxes and 2 solstices. The equinox literally means equal night. Day and night are of equal length. Happens twice a year. And when it's a spring equinox in the northern hemisphere, it's an autumnal equinox in the southern, and vice versa. Easter is another celebration, sacred to Christians, of course, that is timed partly in accordance with the equinox. So that same equinox, that spring or vernal equinox for the northern hemisphere, becomes a starting point in dating Easter. And then they wait for the first Sunday after the first full moon after the equinox in the Western Roman Catholic Church, which influences the other Western Christian denominations. So it will always fall on a Sunday in this cycle of 7 days, obviously because Sunday was the day of the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the renewal of creation. But then that Sunday must be following what's called the Paschal moon. That's the full moon that follows that equinox. And it becomes a movable feast because from year to year, well, the equinox will basically stay the same, but where you get the full moon will differ from calendar year to calendar year, and therefore the Sunday after it will differ, and therefore the date of Easter will differ. Now, Pascha, is a Greek word to do with a Hebrew antecedent, Pesach, which is the Passover feast. So Christians are celebrating a Passover, and the Jews are celebrating their original Passover, which happened when Moses led the Israelites out from Egypt. On that original Passover, where the angel of death came and it passed over the houses that had the blood of the lamb daubed on the post and lintels, those houses that belonged to the Israelites. But it decimated everything else. It killed the firstborn, humans and even animals belonging to the Egyptians. And this event enabled the Israelites to exodus out of Egypt, and it's commemorated by the Jews, has been from that time to the present. In the Christian worldview, there is a relationship to Passover, to the original one, but it has been also developed into a greater, more universal Passover in the sense of Jesus Christ led a Passover out of sin into salvation. Originally, the two sides of the church, East and West, the Greek-speaking East and the Latin-speaking West, dated Easter by looking at that full moon, which the Jews also looked at. For the Jews, it was the full moon in their Hebrew month of Nisan, and it was 14 Nisan that they celebrated their Passover. That's 14 days into a lunation, and we know that a lunation, the time it takes to go from new moon to new moon, is about 29.5 days. So if your new moon occurs at day 1, well, you can't actually see the new moon, but you can sight the first little bit of crescent that comes after the new moon. So if that's day 1, then day dot would be the actual new moon that was invisible. And you count 14 days into the month, you'll have a full moon. Now, in the early days of Christianity, East and West had this idea of, well, since the Council of Nicaea had this idea of dating Easter as the full moon after the equinox, or the Sunday after the first full moon after the equinox. But they also stipulated that it couldn't come before the Jewish Passover. So that was an additional filter. And the reason being is because of the historicity of the Christian faith. It actually depends on historical events that happened in Jerusalem all those years ago. And Jesus's passion, crucifixion, death and resurrection couldn't have taken place before Passover. So that's why they wanted to keep that historical filter in there as well. The Eastern Church continued with that, but after a while, the Western Church let go of the stipulation that it needed to be after the Passover on 14 Nisan. Of course, you will have observed that in the Eastern Church, Christmas, well, we haven't talked about Christmas. That's a fixed feast. It's meant to happen the same day each year. In the Western Church, of course, you know it as the 25th of December. In the Eastern Church, it varies, and it can be as late as the 7th of January. Has all this got to do with the fact that they took different approaches to dating Easter? It's not all to do with the fact that that one wants Easter to fall after the Jewish Passover and the other is not fussed about it. It's also to do with the fact that there are two different calendars operating. There's the Julian calendar that was set up by Julius Caesar in ancient times. But the Western Church under Pope Gregory XIII in 1582 updated the calendar into what's known as the Gregorian calendar, which is what we use today civilly and religiously in the Western world. And it's 13 days ahead of the Julian calendar, so that complicates matters as well. Occasionally, the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church will celebrate Easter on the same date, but over time, the coincidences of their Easters will become rarer and rarer, and there'll come a point in the future where they won't happen at all unless there's a reform implemented in the dating of Easter so that Christians can celebrate Easter at the same time. So we have the moon and the sun like really important in the dating here. With Nowruz, which is important, of course, in the Iranian worldview, and it has become important as an international day. It's to do with the sun and the equinox. Now, the holy month for the Muslims is called Ramadan. And Ramadan is the 9th month in the Islamic lunar calendar. So we've got the Jews and the Muslims using a lunar calendar. We're going to see that the Hindus and the Buddhists do as well. It's the norm in religious practice. The lunar calendar attempts to use the cycles of the moon, the lunation from new moon to new moon, And a certain whole number of those, 12 or 13 in a year, working on 29 or 30 days in a month, and jiggling things a bit so that the lunar cycles line up with the solar cycles. So Ramadan is, of course, a month of fasting. You will have noticed Muslims observing it all around the world. It's meant to happen in that lunar month. And it begins with the first sighting of the crescent moon over Makkah or over your locality. And then it will end with the next sighting, where there's a big feast called Eid al-Fitr. It celebrates the end of the fasting. And the reason that this is marked out in the 9th month for universal Muslim observance is that this commemorates the giving of the Quran by Allah to the Prophet Muhammad through the angel Gabriel or Jibril. So it's a chance for Muslims to renew and deepen their familiarity with the Quran and with their faith tradition. Now, if we go across to Asia, now we can't cover all the religions, but there are a few festivals that are worth mentioning because they involve millions of people. I mean, in the case of the Muslims and the Christians, you're talking billions of people. But the Buddhists have a big festival which has, again, acquired a kind of universal significance. It's called Vesak, and it's spelt Wesak. Pardon me, I've got a tickle in my throat. Now, I might have to suck on this lozenge.
I'll make you a cup of tea with honey in it.
Oh, thanks, Belinda. Something hot would be good, but we'll give this a go first. Yes, Wesak or Vesak. Now, this festival occurs in Buddhism and internationally at the full moon in the month of May. For the tropically astrologically minded, this would be the Taurus full moon, the full moon in the month of the bull. So the zodiac is involved. Now this festival, this full moon, is meant to be a commemoration of the birth, the enlightenment, and the death, final liberation of the founder of the Buddhist religion, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. So the traditional legend has it that he was born at this full moon, maybe around 623 BC. He attained his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree at the May full moon. And when he was finally liberated in that Maha Nirvana, that supreme Nirvana, it was also at the Vesak full moon. And I suppose the United Nations have adopted Vesak as an international day because it wanted to mark the spiritual traditions, the big influence of Buddhist philosophy and its tradition for millions of people in Asia. And it has become an influence around the world too, because we live in a time of globalization and emergent planetary order. The spiritual traditions of the world have gone east, west, north and south. There used to be missionaries that came from the west, from Europe, to Africa and to Asia to bring Christianity. But there have been missionaries that have come from India, Hindu and Buddhist missionaries that have gone to the West and taken their traditions there, that have appealed to a lot of people there as well. That's the world that we live in today. Now, another Buddhist festival I might touch on is one that comes 2 full moons after the Vesak full moon. It's called Asala Puja Day, also known as Dharma Day. It commemorates the first sermon that Buddha delivered in a deer park to his closest disciples. It's after his enlightenment. But do you remember how when we were talking about angles on the zodiac and relationships, we are dealing here with a 2-month interval between this full moon and that full moon. And the angle is called a sextile. It's a 60-degree angle, which is associated with freedom of communication and facility in communication. And it's appropriate that Dharma Day, Asala Puja Day, is a sextile removed from full moon to full moon, from the enlightenment of the Buddha to his sermon, to his articulating the basic problem in the human condition, which he called dukkha, suffering. And proclaiming that there were 4 noble truths that had to be grasped about the human condition. There had to be a recognition of suffering and a recognition of why we suffer. And in Buddha's view, he taught, and that's what the Dharma is, his teaching. There's the Buddha, the Sangha and the Dharma. The Sangha are the monastic orders, the disciples of Buddha, those who follow his way. And the Dharma is the teaching. And the teaching says that it's through desire and attachment that suffering comes about. And another noble truth is that there is a way out. And it obviously has to do with being able to release one's attachments and desires in order to attain what they call nirvana, which literally, I believe, comes from the Sanskrit, meaning the snuffing of the flame, the going out of the flame. What is this flame that's going out? Well, it is the isolated self, the ego, which is the cause of the problem through its attachments and longings and cravings. It perpetuates suffering. So when one's sense of identity is no longer tied up with it, then there comes an end to suffering. And he also articulated what's called the Noble Eightfold Path in this initial sermon in the Deer Park, where he gives 8 different practices, disciplines that help to rise above this problem of suffering. Disciplines like right conduct, right speech, right thought, right livelihood, etc. So as I say, the UN has made an international day of that because of the relevance of the spiritual traditions. And I suppose it's less of a ceremonial religion than most religions, Buddhism. Some people don't even call it a religion. A bit like Taoism, it's more of a philosophical way. And I suppose it made an international day of Nowruz, the spring festival, because the observance of the seasons is of universal significance to people. It has been from time immemorial, and it is a convenient starter. It is the kind of natural marker of a new year. The equinox marking spring in the Northern Hemisphere. That has bid fair as being the best date to mark the beginning of a year. And we see it in some of the religious calendars as well. With Hinduism, they have their lunar calendar, and there are two new moon festivals that are really big. One is called Navaratri, and it usually takes place around September, October. And it's a 9-night Navaratri, nine nights of festival. And it's a festival that has to be, its dating has to be calculated from the new moon, and it commemorates a kind of victory of the forces of good over evil. And in terms of the lunation, those first 9 days of the lunar cycle, after the new moon, when the moon is waxing, those first 9 days are considered to be feminine. So there's they're sacred to the goddess. Durga is the name of the goddess, and there are many forms of the goddess in Hinduism. The feminine divine principle, if you like. And so this principle, this deity is prominent during the Navratri. Now, another festival that people will have noticed Hindus and other Asian peoples, not just Hindus, but in fact Jains, who practice Jainism, and Sikhs also commemorate Diwali.
I was going to say Diwali.
Yeah, the Festival of Lights, which is very picturesque. Like the Chinese New Year. Again, that's a lunar one as well. Usually the new moon in January. And it's very festive and very...
It's a bit like our Christmas, they exchange gifts and stuff.
Yeah, they do that at Chinese New Year. They have lots of lanterns, of course. And in Diwali, there's lots of lanterns and lights and special foods prepared, as with most religious festivals, and the exchange of gifts.
Over the top with the food. Yeah.
In Diwali, there is a commemoration of the victory of light over darkness. And for the Hindus, a lot of the stories and myths associated with it have to do with Lord Rama and his consort Sita and his victory over a demigod, an evil deity. But the Jains will be celebrating Diwali, but they will be commemorating the enlightenment of their last Tirthankara, or teacher in their tradition, whose name was Mahavira. And so for them, Diwali is a celebration of the enlightenment of their religious founder, Mahavira. For the Sikhs, it's both a celebration of the enlightenment of their first Guru, Guru Nanak, and also it is a commemoration of some freedom fighters. One of the Sikh leaders, one of their gurus, and 52 princes that were held prisoner at a later point in history, and they were released on this day. So these are some of the festivals.